as I turn to meet the power. This time, turning white and senses dying.
Thank you, Neelam, for your kind introduction. And I apologize for sitting because I'm limping. I normally stand up and move around as a teacher. So my apology for that. The second thing which I want to caution you, the situation in the Middle East is in a state of flux. So whatever I say, it may become out of date tomorrow. Keep that in mind. I don't have the crystal ball to tell you what exactly going to happen tomorrow or after tomorrow. My presentation, I'm going to shorten it a lot. I thought I'm going to speak to 45 minutes, but then turned out to be 29 minutes and a half. So I have to shorten it. I was going to start talking about American foreign policy in the Middle East, which I'm going to skip. So my presentation today will be divided in a very, very short 4 sections. One section, I call it Introduction to Egypt, try to give you some idea about Egypt. The second part, why I am not surprised what happened in Egypt in the last few weeks. 3, what are some of the distinguishing features of the Egyptian revolution of January 25th? And finally, whether the Egyptian revolution has achieved its goal or not. So we have really a lot of things to talk about. And if I have to skip, you have to forgive me for that. Let's talk about the introduction. I already gave you a map of Egypt, so you can look at it as I am saying a few things about Egypt. If you look at the map, you are going to find out Egypt is really a very, very big country in terms of land. It is approximately 400,000 square miles. Just to give you an idea how big is Egypt, it is as big as Texas and New Mexico, or Texas and California, or if you know Spain, about twice the size of Spain, or about 3 times the size of England. So that gives you an idea about the size of Egypt. The second point, while Egypt is very big, but that bigness is very, very misleading, very, very misleading. It's only 4% of the land of Egypt can be cultivated. Did you hear what I said? Only 4% of the land of Egypt can be cultivated, and about 1.5% of that land is taken up by people. So there's not much land for cultivation. And if you look at where the people live, they live along the strip of the Nile River, which go from south to north. And I don't know how many of you had read about Herodotus, the Greek historian. He described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. This is true then and it's true today. It is, if we remove the Nile from Egypt, Egypt is nothing but a chunk of desert. It will be part of the desert of North Africa, which is the largest desert on earth. Now the third point, the population of Egypt today, and listen to that very carefully, because this is very, very important, is 88 million people. And in 1792, the Egyptian population was 2 million. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was only about 3 or 4 million. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was 7 million. In 1940, it was 20 million. In 1980, it was 40 million. And today is 88 million. And in 15 or 20 years from now, it will be over 100 million people. Can you imagine? These are people, they live along a small narrow strip of the Nile River in Egypt. Over 90% of the population in Egypt happen to be Muslims. Less than 10% of the population happen to be Christian. And the Christian of Egypt, they call themselves Copts. And the Copts is one of the oldest Christian community on earth. And it was founded by nobody else but a disciple of Jesus, St. Mark. And the Christian community in Egypt, it's the largest Christian community in the Middle East. And they happen to be an Orthodox, not Catholic, not Protestant. Point number 5, when you look at Egypt, you see a very important waterway, and that is the Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869. And about 3,500 ships go through the canals every month. 50 ships every day go through the canal carrying nothing but oil. Most of the oil consumed in Europe come through the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is considered to be a very important source of foreign currency. Egypt's an oil-producing country, but they don't really produce a lot of oil. They have approximately 4 billion barrels of a proven reserve, but they produce daily approximately 700,000 barrels of oil a day. That is barely sufficient for local consumption. A few years ago, they used to export a few barrels of oil abroad, but today are no longer exporting any oil abroad. But on the other hand, they do have natural gas. They have approximately 77 trillion cubic feet of gas, which is the third largest proven reserve of gas in Africa after Nigeria and Algeria. Tourism is very, very important source of the Egyptian economy. In the year 2000, there were approximately 5 million tourists. And those 5 million tourists will produce approximately $5 billion. And the expectation in the year 2010, there will be about 7 million tourists producing approximately $7 billion. Finally, Egypt has a very large cadre of educated people. Literacy in Egypt about approximately 70%. But Egypt has 20 public universities, as well as they have 20 private universities, and they have many institutions of higher learning. So every year, thousands and thousands of Egyptians are graduating from university, from the university. But these people don't have any job waiting for them. And I remember in one of my last trips to Egypt, I found out most of the taxi drivers, they have a college degree. They either work in the bureaucracy in the morning, making very little money, and taxi driving is another job to help them out making ends meet. And these are the people, by the way, who made up the revolution on January 25th of this year. Now, my second part, I said I am not surprised what happened in January 25th. Anybody who was studying the local condition in Egypt can tell the elements of an uprising. Anybody who studied the economic, the politics, and the social condition of Egypt in the last 3 decades can find out the elements which are needed to make any uprisings. So let me go very briefly over some of these social, political, and economical elements. Number one, if we studied the economy of Egypt in the last 3 decades, I can describe it, the economy was in a state of shambles. The unemployment officially is 10%, but if you add the underemployed and the partly employed, the unemployment could reach 25 or 30% of the labor force. When you have 30% of unemployment or underemployment or part employment, that is a disaster for any economy. 20% of the Egyptian people live under $2 a day. That is under the poverty line. If you go and visit Cairo, Egypt, which is the capital of Egypt, it has a population unofficially about 20 million, but officially they tell you about 15, 16 million. About 3 million of these people who are living in Cairo they live under $1 a day. And those people who know Cairo very well, you are going to find out there are about 2 million people living where they live between the tombs. Once upon a time, they were a wealthy cemetery, and now people are living in these cemeteries. The middle class, which used to be a very, very important part of Egypt in the 60s and the 70s, started shrinking and started losing its purchasing power. We have a very small elite of less than 10% of the population. They control more than 80% of the Egyptian wealth. Many of them, they live in big villas and gated villas. They send their kids not to public school, they send their kids to private schools with big swimming pool, and they are far away from the millions of the Egyptian masses. The globalization had ruined the Egyptian economy. I will never forget, of some of my trips, I used to go to the traditional market in Egypt to buy Egyptian item as a memento. And I bought coasters with Egyptian theme. You turn it up, it's made in China. That is Khan el-Khalili, the center of Cairo. This is where most of the tourists go. They go and buy supposedly an Egyptian memento, but they are all made in China. The Egyptian economy until 1970 was a state-controlled economy, but under Sadat and Mubarak being privatized, and all these public companies were sold to the cronies of the Mubarak family and his regime. And that's the way it is. The political scene is not better than the economical scene. Egypt, for 30 years, are ruled under emergency rules. Can you imagine that? Emergency rule is supposed to be for a few months, for 6 months, for a year, but not for 30 years. Mubarak himself been in power for 30 years. He keep re-electing himself. And he re-elected himself not with 51%, he re-elected himself with 99.9%, and on and on. The last election, which took place in November 20th, 90% of the seat went to the ruling party. And the opposition party, most of them decided not to participate in the election because they are not allowed to do whatever they were supposed to do in terms of campaigning. The prison system was full with hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, and many of them being tortured and mistreated for many, many years. And one of the funny things, the interior minister who was in charge of the securities, guess how many employees they have? 1.7 million. Almost 1 out of 8 Egyptians work for the interior ministry. Can you imagine that? So that gives you an idea about what I'm saying. The foreign policy was a disaster. The foreign policy alienated not only the Egyptians from their regime, but it alienated the Arab masses everywhere in the Arab world from that regime. Mubarak became the spokesman for the US foreign policy in the Arab world and in the Middle East. And I can tell you, and we can talk about it more, there are a lot of things the US will never be able to do without the Egyptian support in the last 3 or 4 decades. Let me give you just 2 events, and we can talk about it if you want. The US will never be able to bomb Iraq in 1991 without the Egyptian support, without Mubarak support. I should not say the Egyptian support. And the US will never be able to invade Iraq in the year 2003 without the total Mubarak support in those years. I mean, all what I'm trying to say, when you study the politics of Egypt, when you study the economy of Egypt, when you study the social condition of Egypt, all these things lead you to the following conclusion, that the Egyptian situation is a barrel of oil, was waiting for a spark to spark that barrel of oil. And the spark came from where? It came from Tunis. And all of you may remember what happened in Tunis when on December 17, a guy has a master's degree, unemployed, and he tried to make ends meet by buying a few things in the local market. And the government of Tunisia told him, you cannot do that. And he ended up emulated himself. He ended up igniting himself with fire. And that is what ignited the Tunisian revolution, which ended up to the flood of what we call Zayn al-Haribin, his real name Zayn al-Abidin, when he fled to Saudi Arabia. The Tunisian revolution provided the Egyptian with that spark. And that is what happened on January 25th in Egypt, in Square, Liberation Square, and many other parts of Egypt. What I'd like to do now, I'd like to say a few things about some of the uniqueness of the Egyptian revolution. Remember, my discussion really is very shallow, it's very brief, because I am racing with time. The Egyptian revolution is quite a bit unique in the history of man and womankind. It's really a rare event which a lot of people didn't expect. And I expect that this revolution will be studied and restudied. There will be hundreds and hundreds of books written about them in the future by the CIA, by the FBI, by the military colleges, by professors, by journalists, by Egyptian, by Arabs, by American, by anything. It is a very interesting, unique event. And I would like to talk a little bit about some of these unique features, very briefly. The Egyptian revolution, number one, and the Tunisian revolution destroy the myth that the Arab masses do not count in politics. I don't know how many of you observed politics of Egypt or the Arab world in the last 2 or 3 decades. And if you notice that, you are going to find out the neocon in this country and many embedded professors. Embedded professors mean these are embedded with the government, like embedded reporters who are embedded with the government. Many of these embedded professors and neocon promoted the idea that the Arab mass doesn't exist. The Arab masses are lazy, they are very passive, very fearful of power, and because of their religion are very fatalistic, and the US policy should not take them into account when they frame their policy. I will never forget, I was watching the TV at the end of the year 2000s. One of the embedded professor who is still coming on CNN as the expert on the Middle East, testifying in the front of the Foreign Affairs State Senate Committee under Biden at that time, and he was asked the question, Mr. Rajami, do we need to worry about the Arab street, about the Arab masses? He said, the Arab masses is a myth. When we invade Iraq, you are going to be received by flowers and roses. And now you know what happened when we invaded Iraq. So the Egyptian revolution destroys that myth that the Arab mass doesn't count. The second point, the Egyptian revolution so far had been one of the most peaceful revolutions really on earth, in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi of India, in the tradition of Martin Luther King in this country. The people on Liberation Square in Egypt or any part of Egypt, none of them carry any arms or any pistol or any gun. To the contrary, the government forces use fire and guns against them, and in the process, officially, 370 people were killed and about 5,000 people were wounded. The Egyptian revolution is not limited to one region in Egypt. I mean, most television coverage in this country, they focus on Cairo, on the Liberation Plaza, But in reality, it happened every single part of Egypt. It happened in Alexandria, it happened in Asyut, it happened in Suez, it happened in Safioum, it happened everywhere in Egypt. So there's not only one liberation square, there were thousands of them throughout Egypt. Indeed, it was a national revolution rather than to one area. The Egyptian revolution started in the beginning, organized in the beginning by the very, very young people through the social media. But very quickly, by the way, very quickly it transformed into a national revolutions in which people of different generations, different ages participated in that revolution. You see people of all walks of life, different occupation, different skills. Everybody was there. You see the educated as well as uneducated. The people with the jalabiya, the traditional Egyptian costume, as well as the people who wear Western clothes and on. Now, the Egyptian revolution was leaderless. Was leaderless in the following sense, that there was not one single leader leading that revolution and everybody galvanizing around that person. In reality, there were many, many leaders, and most of these leaders happened to be very well educated and highly skilled in the in the social media. The Egyptian revolution is multi-religious. It is not limited to the Muslims. Both the Christians and the Muslims participated in that revolution. I will never forget, I happened to have the Arabic channels, and I was watching Al Jazeera and a few other channels, and you see both the Muslim and the Copts praying on Friday or on Sunday, but the most amazing things about it, they both shouted, "We are Egyptian and we want the regime to go. We are all Egyptian, we want the regime to go." And that is, and also during that period of time, we learned something honestly very, very important, but the media in this country didn't pay attention to it. There was a bombing of a Coptic church at the beginning of this year in Egypt, and the Egyptian government at that time blamed it, quote unquote, Al-Qaeda of Gaza Strip. We found out during that revolution that incident was organized by the Ministry of the Interior in order to create tension between the Muslim and the Christian. And by the way, we have a lot of evidence this is what is happening in Iraq. A lot of these bombings are done by agents to the Mossad or the CIA or somebody else, but are blamed on Al-Qaeda. Now, the demonstration, the last point which I want to make about the Egyptian revolution, that by all account, the people who organize and participate in that revolution are very well behaved. And the amazing thing, they say there were no female pinching, and there was no sexual harassment of anything, because there are a lot of incidents taking place in Liberation Square and on and on. And not only that, we learn that many of the people who participate in the revolution, they form up teams to clean up the area or to protect the area from hoodlums and from bad elements. Now, let's talk about the implication and try to conclude the discussion quickly. And here I would like to make short comments about implication to the US, implication to Israel, implication to the Arab world, and then talk a little bit about did really the revolution achieve its goals, or we are just having fun talking. What is the implications for the US? Well, there's a very good chance, I said there's a very good chance, I'm not sure about it, that the US may lose a very, very important allies in that neighborhood. But I'm not sure about it, and I have some doubt about it, and I'll talk about it. I remember what I said, without Egypt, the US will never be able to do many things in the Middle East in the last 30 years. One of them, the invasion of Iraq. One of them, the bombing of Iraq in 1991, and many, many other things. it is very possible that we may lose Egypt, but on the other hand, there's a big question mark. And why I say there's a big question mark? Who are the people in charge of Egypt today? And you are going to find out most of them are still symbol of the old regimes. And who are they in particular? The military or the council of the military in charge of Egypt. Now, when you study the bio of these military council, you are going to find out many of them are trained in this country. And many of them have a very strong connection with the US military forces. Now remember, we give Egypt approximately 1.3 billion of military aid, not economical aid. We don't give that much economic aid, very little. We are not interested in economy. We are interested only in the military establishment. So we send them about approximately 100.3 billion. All their arms are made in this country. Even the tear gas bomb are made in this country. Can you imagine Egypt, 88 million people that cannot produce tear gas bomb? Can you imagine that? So that gives you an idea. I don't know how many of you watch Jon Stewart. I do, because I like to laugh before I go to bed. Because life is too problematic in this country. And I will never forget, that's what happened. The first week of the revolution, Jon Stewart had Michael Mullen, the chair of the armed forces in this country. And Chairman Mullen said the following. He said, all these military leaders in Egypt are trained in this country. And we know them very, very well. And we have an open communication with them. And we talk to them all the time on the phone. And we tell them, whatever we need, we are ready to help you out. Now, these are the people who are in charge of the Egyptian revolution right now. And if you study their behavior, you are going to find out they never acted. They always reacted. Did you hear what I'm saying? They always reacted. They never really acted. They were forced to get rid of Mubarak. Not they acted on that, they were forced. Number two, when they become totally in charge, they were forced to dissolve the parliament and the Shura Council. They didn't act on it on their own. They were forced to get rid of the the prime minister of 4 or 5 days ago, and now they have a new prime minister. And they were forced to have a committee to study changing the constitution. And there are a lot of things they have not acted on it. And those of you who are following the news, there's still a lot of demonstration in Egypt. They want, quote unquote, to dissolve or do something about the intelligence services, which has a terrible reputation in Egypt. And they haven't done anything about it yet. So this is what I'm trying to say, is that we may lose Egypt, but it's still too early to say that. But I can say one thing for sure, that the US cannot rely from now on automatically totally on Egypt. I mean, they have to think it twice before they start forcing Egypt to act in a certain direction. In other words, the US has to be more now sensitive to the local need within Egypt and the local need within the Arab world. On the other hand, things may go in the other direction. If we have genuinely a truly representative government in Egypt, but it's still too early to tell. So that is concerning the US, and we can talk more about it later. Now, regarding Israel, that is a very interesting problem. Because when you talk about the US, you talk really about Israel. I mean, Israel and the US are more or less the same when it comes to the questions of the Middle East. You cannot really separate them. But my speculation is as follows, that no matter what government in Egypt is going to be, that the government will never cancel 1979 Camp David agreement with Israel. I don't think they will cancel it, no matter what kind of government. But there's something else may happen, is that right now there's a kind of a siege around Gaza Strip because of Egypt. I don't think Egypt will go along anymore with Israel and the US to continue that siege around Gaza. I have a feeling they are going to open the border with Gaza, but very quietly, without any fanfare and without anything. And I think if they do that, that will be a step in the right direction. Because that siege against Gaza by the Egyptian government had angered the Egyptian people tremendously. There's another thing regarding Israel, and that's not too many people know about it. Remember I said Egypt has a lot of natural gas, about 77 trillion, and they do export part of it to Jordan, part of it to Israel, part of it to Syria, part to Spain, but they have a kind of a secret deal with Israel. The treaty have not been published, it's not transparent, and all the indications seem to suggest that the Egyptian made a deal with Israel to sell gas under the international price. And there's one estimate is by as much as 1/3 under the international price of gas. That deal is not going to continue. I can guarantee you that, no matter what kind of a government. That deal, it may have to be it's going to be renegotiated, but it's not going to be continued the way it used to be. So that deal is gone. There's some indication already the pipeline had been sabotaged, and there's no gas going to Israel. And by the way, that gas is a very important element of the Israeli electricity. It's to provide Israel with 20 or to 40%. You don't know which one. I had read it 20, I read 40, but it's all it depends. There's another thing, Israel going to be a loser, that Israel for the last 30 or 40 years since Camp David, they tried to normalize the relationship with Egypt. And by normalizing, I don't mean having a diplomatic relationship. And by talking about normalizing, by lovemaking, having exchange of students, cultural exchange, by commerce, by whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about. That dream is gone. To begin with, despite Mubarak's support to the idea of normalization, the Egyptian people are rejecting that, period. And if you don't believe me, just read what's happening, whether by the journalists, whether by the lawyers, whether by the engineers, or by the doctors, and on and on and on. So that dream of normalizing a relationship with Egypt is gone. What about the Arab world? Egypt is a very important country in the Arab world. It is the largest country in terms of population, 88 million. It's 1 out of 4 Arabs live in Egypt. Did you hear what I said? 1 out of 4 of Arabs live in Egypt. And today there's about 6 to 8 million Egyptians. They live throughout the Arab countries. Those of you who are watching the news about Libya, we were told, and again the statistic is very murky, between 1 million to 1 million Egyptians living in Libya alone. And there are about 500,000 living in Jordan, that poor country. And there's about 4 to 5 million of them live in the Gulf country, and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, etc., etc. And what do? Well, they do everything on earth, from cleaning the bathroom to all the way being a doctors or teachers or professors or consultant to the king or the queen or to the president, etc., etc. They do play a very critical role. And those of you who studied modern education in the Arab country, you are going to find out Egypt played a very, very important role in the process of development of modern education throughout the Arab countries. Once upon a time, the Gulf country, all their teachers are from Egypt. Even elementary school teachers were from Egypt. So they do play a critical role throughout the Arab world. And so whatever happened in Egypt is going to have an impact elsewhere in the Arab world. And as all of you know, somebody has said, whether I said it or somebody said it, revolution is contagious. Some of you are old enough to remember 1990. Many of you are not old enough to remember that. But you remember what happened in 1990. You read probably a lot about it, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we have a series of revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, one after another, one after another. And honestly, if you are following the news today, we have demonstration everywhere. But unfortunately, the mass media in this country are not focusing on all of them. They are focusing on Libya because we want to occupy Libya. We are not hearing much about Yemen. We are not hearing much about Oman. We are not hearing much about other countries, including, by the way, Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of disturbances going on in Saudi Arabia. And the king, in his wisdom, by the way, he came up with an interesting idea. He said, Islam is against demonstration. I have no idea where did he find out. I read the Quran 20 times, and I never read anything about that. But you are going to hear more about it, and that is the way it is. Now, let me conclude a few things so we can have some discussion. As it had been said, when you study any revolution, there's always a consensus in the beginning. We all want to get rid of the regime. Everybody agreed. But once you start discussing what do you want to accomplish after getting rid of the regime, then we have disagreement. It is too early to tell. We have only a month, so we cannot really predict what is happening. But let me make two general comments from my perspective. The most important challenging task for any new government in Egypt. And what is that two most important challenges? The first one is population. Until and unless they control the growth of the Egyptian population, Egypt is doomed. Did you hear what I'm saying? It is really doomed. I mean, Egypt is not a wealthy country by any stretch of imagination. Their important income comes from four basic things. Tourism would generate maybe $5–6 billion. Suez Canal generate about $5 billion. The cotton industry, which doesn't generate much, and a few other things. So Egypt is not a wealthy country, and they have to do something about their population. I mean, within 20 years, it may be over 100. And the question, and that's the second challenge, how do you create jobs? This is a very challenging task. How do you create jobs to meet the growth of the Egyptian population? I will never forget, and this is an old statement, when I was in Iraq. You see, by the way, I come from Iraq originally, or to be more exact, occupied Iraq, not Iraq, occupied Iraq. I remember when I was there, I heard the president of Egypt at that time, Nasser. And at that time, the population of Egypt, 25 million people. He said, we build 3 schools every 2 days, but we are not keeping up with the growth of the population. Did you hear what I'm saying? So it's a huge dilemma. How to do that, that's a subject for another hour or two, etc. So I think I'm going to stop here, not because I want to stop here, because I want really to give you a chance to express yourself and perhaps answering some of your concerns and some of your questions. And thank you.
What are the common jobs that people have in Egypt?
Well, the common job, well, that's a good question. Believe it or not, tourism creates approximately 2.5 million jobs in Egypt. Still, there's about 1/3 of the Egyptians work in agriculture, and about another 30% work in varieties of industries. There are a lot of industries: cement industry, sugar industry, and iron industry, and many other industries. So the problem with Egypt, they graduate too many skilled people. Remember what I said, they have 20 private university, 20 public university, and many schools of higher learning. And somewhere I read, but I cannot testify to what I'm going to say to you, that there are more university graduates in Egypt than England. I read it somewhere, but I was looking for that reference. I couldn't find it. So if you find something different, don't take me on that. So there are a lot of graduates. And these are the people who made really the revolution of January 25th. And a lot of these people, they have high expectation. I mean, if you study the Egyptian bureaucracy, you are going to find out is overblown bureaucracy. The study done about the Egyptian bureaucracy, they found out the average Egyptian bureaucrat worked 20 minutes a day. You may find 5 or 6 people are in the same office do exactly the same thing. The government hired them to absorb the unemployment, but they are not paid very well. So many of them, they have to look for another job. And I think I told you in my trips to Egypt, most of the taxi drivers have college degree. These people have a government job in the morning, but they are working on the side to supplement their income. And the needs keep going up and up and up. There's another problem going on in the Egyptian system, is that the school system, because of the expansion, the quality is going down. And many people in high schools or elementary school, they have to hire a private tutor to tutor their kids in order to pass the government exam. So that's an additional burden. And I discovered that by talking to the taxi drivers. Yeah, but why you are working? He said, well, I have to pay for the private lesson to my kids who are going to school, and on and on. So this is why I said, I mean, your question is a very good question. It's a big, challenging question. How do you create good jobs in that country? Yeah, come on and run. Come on, guy. You are still a young guy. You are not limping like me. You are Egyptian?
Yeah.
Oh, good for you. So you come and talk.
First, excuse my English. Just I have a question. As you mentioned, Israel and United States are the same. And as you mentioned also, Israel gonna lose a lot of money. It's almost $10 billion a year because of the natural gas. And as I remember, what happened when in Palestine they got elected, the Hamas government.
Yes, yeah.
And everybody was saying we need like a fair government and fair election and stuff. And when the people chose Hamas as their government, Israel didn't like Hamas's government, and also United States. And in the media these days, Israel doesn't like the new Egyptian government. So what do you think? The United States government got rid of the new government in Egypt like they did to Palestinian government?
You see, my own feeling, as I said, Israel is probably going to be the biggest loser because no matter what kind of government you are going to have in Egypt, it is not going to act like the government of Mubarak. Even if we assume it's going to be somewhat a conservative government, that government, in order to stay in power in Egypt, it has to reflect somewhat the Egyptian masses. It has to reflect somewhat the Egyptian feeling. Otherwise, we'll have another really revolution. And by the way, Israel is going to lose on 2 grounds. It's not only about the gas deal. They have to pay fair price if they want to continue to pay. But there is something else, that Israel is not going to trust Egypt, no matter what they say, that we are not going to cancel Camp David agreement, etc., etc. Because of Camp David agreement, Israel have changed their military strategy. Now they focus on Lebanon, on Syria, which means they don't have to worry about the biggest enemy of all, that was Egypt. And one study I was told, because of that shift, that Israel was saving about $5 to $6 billion. So now they have to rechange somewhat their military strategy, and they may have still to position some Israeli quote-unquote soldier on the southern border with Egypt. But going back to the original point, is that the U.S. has a funny definition of democracy. U.S. definition of democracy, any government that say yes sir to us. Any government which disagree with us, it's not democratic. They are leftists, they are pinky, they are whatever it is. So why they didn't like Hamas? Well, Hamas, as you pointed out, won through the democratic process. But Hamas disagree with our foreign policy and disagree with Israel, and therefore, instead of talking to them, instead of moderating them, we try to isolate them and push them to the extreme. My philosophy, I have said that in the past, include everybody in the political process. Do not exclude anybody. The moment you exclude people from the political process, the moment you are pushing them to be an extremist. And that's what happened throughout history, in the recent time and in the old time. And I have the feeling, have we reacted to Hamas differently, and instead of isolating them, and instead of boycotting them, instead of trying to get rid of them, we could have moderated them by including them in the negotiation or in the discussion. But unfortunately, I'm not in charge of the American foreign policy maker. Well, I tell you, it's really a serious challenge. You have to do a serious family planning. I have to say, in fairness, between 1980 up till now, the Egyptian government are doing whatever they can to do a serious family planning. But still, the average number of children per family in Egypt today about 3. In 1960, there were 5 or 6. So there's a lot of improvement, but the base is very high. You see, my philosophy is they should do what they did in China. But I don't think they have the capacity to implement that policy. 1 child or maybe 2 children, forget about 1 child, maybe that's too extreme, but they should impose a policy of 2 children per family. But they should do that not by law, but by giving incentive and disincentive. And that's what they did in Iran, by the way. If you have more than 2 children, you will not be eligible to schools, for example, or university, or hospital, or. So they should do a lot of incentive and disincentive. And they have to be serious about it. Furthermore, it is time for the Muslim imams. It's time for them to think very seriously to convince their audience, because they are very important tools on Friday. They give a Friday sermon to tell their audience to do what they are supposed to do. In Indonesia, which is far away, they did something very, very important. You cannot be an imam unless if you take 3-week seminars on family planning, with the purpose of conveying what they learned to their captive audience on a Friday prayer. And I think this is honestly what they should do in Egypt too. I think there are 3 guiding principles guiding American foreign policy in the last 3 decades. And when I talk about these guiding principles, they're the real principle, not what the politicians tell us. You know, when you study what the politicians tell us, that's public relations. And I'm not concerned about what the politicians tell us. But what I'm concerned what exactly we do. And that is what I'm talking about. There are 3 guiding principles. The first guiding principle is really to control the oil in one fashion or another. We do whatever we can to control it directly or indirectly. Why Middle Eastern oil is very important? Because 2/3 of the proven reserve of all oil is located in the Middle East. Furthermore, it is very cheap to produce. And listen to that carefully, and then we can argue about it, that most of the oil produced in the Middle East are available for export. The Middle East produces approximately 29 million barrels of oil a day, about 20 of that million available for export. Now, the Middle East and North Africa, it is almost 500 million people, about 500 million people, yeah. But how much oil they consume? About 10 million barrels a day. So 20 of them available for export. Now imagine, and I want you just to imagine, do you think we let this country to develop? Because how do you measure development? You measure development by how much they consume gas. We are the most advanced country on earth, and we consume approximately 21 million barrels of oil a day. Did you hear what I'm saying? Now, if that oil is going to be used by the Middle Eastern people themselves, what does it mean? It means it's not available for export, which means it's going to affect the process of development in Europe and in this country, because there's no other area on earth that can replace Middle Eastern oil today, period. You can talk about West Africa, you can talk about Russia, you can talk about Mexico, you can talk about anything. None of them has the capacity to produce that much. And if that oil is needed in the Middle East, we are gone. And this is why bring me to another important principle in my view. Many of you may disagree with me, that we'll do whatever we can to disunite the Arab world, to disunite this country. We are going to oppose any form of unity among these countries. In 1958, I'm sorry, when Egypt and Syria became united, we did everything on earth to disunite them. And that's exactly what happened in 1961. Because any unity is a challenge to our hegemony and our control in that neighborhood, period. And the third guiding principle, which may annoy some of you in this audience, is that we are one of the most important guiding principles is to keep Israel superior and to be a regional power in that neighborhood. How do we do that? By giving them aid every year. It's a small country of 7 million or less, but they receive about $3 to $4 billion of our foreign aid. There is no country on earth receive that amount. And we allow them to develop the most advanced military technology on earth. So these are the three important guiding principles. There are many other, but I don't think I have the time to finish it in 5 points. Thank you. Thank you.
Put your hands into the fire.